4,000 years ago, people pressed reed into wet clay and recorded a truth so bleak it feels impossible for a civilization at the dawn of writing to accept it without protest. That human life was designed for labor, destined for loss, and guaranteed no escape after death. Why would the earliest writers describe existence as a closed system rather than a journey of progress? Why would gods be portrayed not as saviors, but as masters? Why does the afterlife appear not as reward or punishment, but as a permanent sentence shared by all? Why do the oldest tablets insist that mortality itself is structural, not moral? Why does memory matter more than justice, and ritual more than hope? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. In the land between two rivers, where silt from seasonal floods turned flat earth into fields of grain, the first cities rose without any promise that life would improve with time. Writing did not emerge to celebrate freedom or destiny. It emerged to record obligation. Clay tablets hardened by fire preserve a worldview in which existence itself was already mapped, layered, and confined. Reality was not infinite or open-ended. It was stacked like architecture, each level assigned its function, each boundary enforced by powers older than humanity. Above everything stretched the realm called An, a word that meant both sky and heaven, because to the Sumerians the blue vault overhead was not empty space, but a domain of authority. This was not a paradise meant for human souls, but a place of governance. The stars were not distant suns. They were visible gods, fixed in their positions like watchful sentinels. The planets wandered across the sky with intention, each associated with a divine personality whose movements were read as decisions rather than accidents. Night after night, priests observed these paths, not to predict the future out of curiosity, but to detect shifts in divine attention that could affect crops, floods, or war. Between heaven and earth moved air and storm, ruled by Enlil, whose name meant Lord Wind, a title that sounds gentle until one remembers that wind in southern Mesopotamia brought dust storms, drought, and destruction. Enlil was not distant. He was the enforcer of separation, the power who had torn heaven away from earth in the beginning, so that creation would not collapse back into undifferentiated chaos. His authority did not come from moral wisdom, but from control. When boundaries held, order survived. When boundaries failed, cities fell. Earth itself, called Ki, was not imagined as a globe floating in space. It was a flat disk resting on a cosmic sea, solid enough to build upon, but fragile enough to crack under divine displeasure. This was the human realm, the only place where mortals could breathe, build, and labor. Rivers crossed it like veins, carrying life from distant mountains whose slopes marked the edge of the known world. Beyond those mountains lay foreign lands and unknown dangers, places associated with the same word used for the underworld, because both were beyond control. Beneath the ground flowed the Abzu, a vast freshwater deep imagined as an underground ocean feeding springs, wells, and rivers. Anyone who had drawn water from a well understood intuitively why such a place must exist. The Abzu was ruled by Enki, the god of wisdom and craft, whose intelligence expressed itself not through mercy, but through cleverness. He was the god who knew how things worked, how water flowed, how words carried power, how rituals bent outcomes. His temple stood at Eridu, a city believed to be the first ever founded, positioned symbolically above this hidden reservoir of life. And then there was Kur. Kur was not beneath the Abzu in a geological sense, but beneath it in meaning. It was the realm that completed the structure, the place every human would eventually reach. Its name could mean mountain, foreign land, or underworld, because all three shared the same quality. They were places you did not belong. When Kur referred to the land of the dead, its meaning was precise and unchanging. It was the house of darkness, the place of no return. Death in this system was not a transition toward judgment or reward. It was relocation. The dead did not rise upward. They went down and east beyond the sunrise to a city made of dust. Entry was regulated through gates, 7 of them, each stripping away what remained of identity. Clothing, jewelry, symbols of office, even divine authority in the case of gods, were removed step by step. By the time one stood before the rulers of Kur, nothing distinguished king from laborer. Those rulers were not executioners or torturers, they were administrators. A group of divine judges sat in silence and confirmed what had already happened. The living had become dead, and the dead belonged here. Kur did not punish sin because moral accounting was not its purpose. It enforced permanence. Once inside, there was no path back, only existence reduced to shadow. The dead were described as wearing feathers like birds, a haunting image suggesting lightness without freedom, movement without escape. The sun itself passed through Kur each night, illuminating the realm briefly as it traveled toward dawn. But this light brought no warmth or hope. It only confirmed that even cosmic cycles obeyed boundaries humans could not cross. The queen of this realm ruled without appeal, not because she was cruel, but because the system required an end point. A world without finality would unravel. This vertical structure defined everything. Humans did not live at the center of the universe by privilege, but by function. They occupied the only layer where work could be done, where food could be grown, where gods could be served. Heaven governed, earth labored. Kur received what remained. There was no expectation that movement between these realms would become easier with time. Progress was not assumed. Stability was the highest good. Writing itself reinforced this structure. The earliest tablets are not myths but lists, grain rations, labor assignments, temple inventories. They read like the paperwork of a managed system, because that is what the world was perceived to be. Even stories about gods and creation were shaped by this logic. When the universe was organized, it was divided into jurisdictions, not opportunities. Each realm had its ruler. Each ruler had demands. Each demand required human effort. Seen this way, the cosmos was not hostile, but it was indifferent. It did not ask whether humans wanted this arrangement. It simply functioned. Rain fell when gods allowed it. Floods came when boundaries failed. Death arrived without exception. The brilliance of the Sumerian worldview lies not in hope, but in its honesty. It did not soften the edges of existence. It described reality as enclosed, hierarchical, and inescapable. This structure did not need walls or chains to function. It was enforced by ritual, memory, and fear of imbalance. As long as offerings were made and boundaries respected, life continued. When rituals failed, chaos followed. The prison was not a place humans were locked into. It was the architecture of reality itself. And once written into clay, it became permanent, outlasting the cities that believed it, waiting beneath the sand to tell later ages that the first civilization did not imagine freedom at the beginning of history, but confinement. Humanity did not appear in this system by accident or as an afterthought. According to the oldest Mesopotamian creation traditions, people were introduced into the cosmos to solve a problem, and that problem was labor. Before humans existed, the gods themselves were burdened with maintaining the world they had organized. Canals had to be dug to control the rivers. Fields had to be cleared and planted. Cities had to be built and supplied. The universe functioned, but it required constant work, and even gods grew tired. The earliest surviving versions of this story describe a time when divine beings performed the tasks that later defined human life. They worked the soil, carried baskets of earth, and maintained the infrastructure that allowed civilization to exist. This labor was not symbolic. It was physical, repetitive, and exhausting, mirroring the same work humans would later perform under the sun. Eventually, the younger gods rebelled, not out of moral outrage, but out of exhaustion. They laid down their tools and surrounded the dwelling of the chief authority, demanding relief. The response was not negotiation or reform. It was replacement. Rather than redistribute the burden among the gods, a new being was proposed, one specifically designed to work, to obey, and to die. Humanity was conceived as a workforce engineered into the structure of reality. Creation, in this sense, was not an act of love or generosity. It was a management decision. The process itself reveals how humans were understood. Clay was chosen as the base material, the same earth used to make bricks and tablets. Clay dries, cracks, and returns to dust, making it a perfect symbol for mortality. But clay alone was not enough. To animate it, divine substance was required. The solution was blood, the visible carrier of life. A lesser god was sacrificed, his blood mixed with earth, producing beings who could think, speak, and work, but who would never escape decay. This mixture defined human nature permanently. Intelligence came from the divine element, mortality from the earth. Humans were not meant to rival gods because the proportion was wrong by design. Enough divinity to function, not enough to threaten. Enough awareness to understand obligation, not enough power to refuse it. Once created, humans fulfilled their purpose immediately. They multiplied, cultivated land, dug canals, and built cities. Most importantly, they fed the gods. Temples became centers not only of worship, but of production, storage, and distribution. Offerings were not optional expressions of gratitude. They were payments required to keep the cosmos operational. Gods depended on them, and that dependency shaped everything. This arrangement worked until it worked too well. Humanity became numerous and active, filling the world with sound. The noise of tools, voices, rituals, and celebrations disturbed the gods, who valued rest above all else. Irritation replaced satisfaction. What followed was not moral judgment, but population control. Disaster after disaster was sent to reduce human numbers. Disease thinned cities. Drought withered crops. Famine followed. Each time, clever intervention allowed humans to survive, restoring balance temporarily. But the cycle could not continue indefinitely. A more decisive solution was chosen. A flood meant to erase humanity entirely, returning the world to silence. Even this act reveals the nature of divine authority. The decision was practical, not ethical. Humans were not destroyed for wrongdoing, but for inconvenience. And when the flood succeeded too well, the gods faced an unexpected consequence. Without humans, there were no offerings, no food, no rituals. The divine hierarchy, accustomed to being served, found itself deprived. The regret that followed was immediate and revealing. The problem was not the loss of human life, but the loss of service. When a surviving human offered sacrifice after the waters receded, the gods gathered around the smoke like starving creatures. Humanity was restored, not as a favor, but as a necessity. This time restrictions were imposed, lifespans were shortened, death was spread across all ages, fertility was limited, infant mortality became part of the system. These were not punishments, they were adjustments. Humanity needed to exist in sufficient numbers to work and worship, but never so many as to disturb divine comfort again. From that point on, suffering was built into human existence as a feature, not a flaw. Labor, disease, loss, and death were mechanisms of control. Humans were not expected to transcend them, only to endure them. In exchange, the gods maintained order, ensuring that the sun rose, rivers flowed, and seasons continued. This relationship was never equal. Humans belonged to the category called Namlu, a word meaning humanity, but carrying implications of status and duty. Gods belonged to a separate category entirely, immortal and authoritative. No amount of devotion could bridge this divide. Even kings, who ruled by divine mandate, remained mortal servants destined for the same fate as the poorest laborer. Servitude did not end with death. The underworld was not freedom from work, but its continuation in diminished form. The dead existed as shades, dependent on offerings made by the living. Neglect resulted in hunger and restlessness. Even memory became a form of labor imposed on descendants, binding generations into an unbroken chain of obligation. Within this framework, rebellion was meaningless. Humans could not overthrow gods any more than clay could rebel against the kiln. The system did not require belief to function, it required participation. Rituals performed incorrectly brought disaster. Rituals ignored invited abandonment. Survival depended not on justice, but on compliance. Yet within this confinement, humans built laws, poetry, music, and cities of astonishing complexity. Not because they believed freedom awaited them, but because meaning had to be created where none was promised. Work was unavoidable, but how one worked mattered. Memory could not defeat death, but it could resist erasure. The tragedy of this worldview lies not in cruelty, but in clarity. Humanity was never deceived about its place. From the moment clay was mixed with blood, the terms were fixed. Humans existed to serve, to suffer limitation, and to disappear into darkness when their usefulness ended. The prison was not hidden. It was written openly, pressed into clay by hands that already knew there would be no escape. The reality described by these myths survives not as rumor or legend, but as physical objects shaped by human hands. The tablets themselves are unremarkable at first glance. They are not monuments or treasures. They are pieces of clay, often no larger than a modern book, pressed flat while wet and left to dry in the sun. Their endurance comes not from intention, but from accident. Cities burned, roofs collapsed, archives caught fire, and the heat that destroyed entire neighborhoods baked these tablets hard, preserving them for thousands of years beneath layers of debris. Each tablet carries lines of wedge-shaped impressions made with a cut reed. This system of writing, called cuneiform because of its triangular marks, was not decorative. It was utilitarian. A single sign could represent a sound, a word, or an idea depending on context, much like how the word bank can mean money or river depending on use. Scribes learned hundreds of these signs through years of training, copying the same texts again and again until muscle memory replaced uncertainty. Writing was labor, and literacy was a profession. Most of what survives from early Mesopotamia has nothing to do with gods or myths. It is accounting. Lists of barley rations, records of sheep births, contracts for land sales, assignments of workers to canal projects. These documents reveal a civilization obsessed with record-keeping because control depended on documentation. Every obligation had to be written down, witnessed, sealed, and archived. The divine worldview was mirrored in bureaucracy. Order was maintained through constant recording. Mythological texts existed within this system, not outside it. They were copied in scribal schools as part of education, treated as authoritative works that explained why the world functioned the way it did. A story was not fiction in the modern sense. It was explanation. When a tablet described the underworld, it was not offering metaphor, but structure. When it described gods creating humans for labor, it was not speculation, but justification for the existing social order. Because these texts were copied over centuries, sometimes in different cities and different languages, scholars can compare versions. Differences appear, but the core ideas remain stable. The underworld is always permanent. Human mortality is always unavoidable. The gods always demand service. This consistency matters. It shows that the worldview was not the invention of a single priest or poet, but a shared cultural framework reinforced across generations. Understanding these tablets requires understanding how they were read. Ancient Mesopotamians did not approach texts as private readers seeking personal meaning. Reading was communal and authoritative. A tablet's content carried weight because it had been written, copied, and preserved. Words impressed into clay were harder to ignore than spoken words carried by wind. Writing fixed reality in place. Later scribes even created lexical lists, essentially dictionaries, pairing older Sumerian words with newer Akkadian equivalents. These lists explained meanings, contexts, and proper usage. They existed because language changed, but tradition demanded continuity. The past could not be abandoned simply because it became difficult to understand. It had to be translated, not replaced. This is why claims of hidden meanings fail under scrutiny. The language is known. The grammar is understood. Thousands of tablets use the same words in the same ways across centuries. When a term appears in a myth and in a legal contract with the same meaning, interpretation becomes anchored. Scholars are not guessing. They are reading. The material nature of the tablets also shapes interpretation. Clay is finite. Space is limited. Writers were economical. They did not encode elaborate secrets or symbolic puzzles meant for distant future readers. They wrote what mattered to them now: obligations, structures, explanations. When they described the afterlife as dust and darkness, it was because that image communicated reality as they understood it. The dead did not feast or rejoice, they endured. Even poetic language followed practical logic. Metaphors were drawn from daily experience. Dust was everywhere. Birds were common scavengers. Gates controlled access to cities and temples. These images required no abstraction. Anyone hearing the text read aloud would understand immediately what was being conveyed. The underworld was a city because cities were the most complex environments people knew. A city without light, without food, without exit was the most effective way to describe permanent confinement. Tablets describing divine judgment use the same terms found in court records. Judges sit. Decisions are rendered. Outcomes are final. The difference is not in process, but in scale. The underworld court did not debate innocence or guilt. It confirmed status. You were dead. Therefore, you belonged there. The durability of these tablets creates an uncomfortable continuity. The same hands that recorded grain deliveries also recorded the inevitability of death. The same institutions that managed labor also preserved myths, explaining why labor existed. There was no contradiction. Administration and theology reinforced each other. Humans worked because they were created to work. Humans died because they were made from clay. Humans descended to the underworld because that was where all dead humans went. Modern readers often search these texts for rebellion, hope, or coded resistance. What they find instead is acceptance, not passive resignation, but clear-eyed acknowledgement. The system could not be escaped, but it could be navigated. One could perform rituals correctly. One could ensure proper burial. One could maintain memory through children and monuments. These were not paths to freedom, but to stability within confinement. The tablets themselves embody this mindset. They do not cry out against injustice. They explain how to survive within it. They teach which offerings appease which gods. They list which rituals avert which disasters. They record which words summon protection and which mistakes invite harm. Knowledge was not power in the modern sense. It was insulation against chaos. When cities fell and populations were displaced, tablets were buried, broken, forgotten. Centuries later, they were uncovered and read by people who lived in worlds shaped by entirely different assumptions. Yet the text did not change. The clay held. The words remained. They describe a universe without progress, without redemption, without escape, and they do so calmly, precisely, and without apology. This is why these tablets matter. Not because they hint at lost technologies or hidden histories, but because they reveal how the first writers understood existence itself. Writing did not begin as an act of liberation. It began as a tool of containment. And pressed into clay, that containment became permanent, waiting silently for a future that would struggle to accept how early humanity learned to describe its place in the world. Among all the figures described in the tablets, none have been more distorted by later imagination than the Anunnaki. In the original texts, they are neither mysterious visitors nor hidden masters of technology. They are administrators of order, divine figures whose authority is tied not to innovation, but to continuity. Their name derives from lineage rather than function, identifying them as the offspring of the primordial powers of heaven and earth. To ancient readers, this immediately placed them within a family structure, not a foreign invasion. In the earliest layers of tradition, the Anunnaki appear as an assembly. They gather, deliberate, and decree. Their role resembles that of a council rather than individual heroes. Decisions affecting gods and humans alike are made collectively, reinforcing the idea that power in the cosmos is institutional rather than personal. Authority does not rest in charisma or strength, but in position within an established hierarchy. Over time, their function narrows. As religious thought develops and traditions merge, the Anunnaki become increasingly associated with the underworld. They are named as judges seated in Kur, presiding over the arrival of the dead. This shift does not represent demotion or punishment. It reflects specialization. In a universe defined by boundaries, someone must enforce the most final boundary of all. The Anunnaki become that enforcement. Judgment in this context does not resemble moral trial. There is no weighing of virtue against vice, no reward for goodness or punishment for cruelty. The judges confirm what is already true. The living have crossed into death. Their role is to assign placement, not fate. Status in life, the quality of burial, and the continuation of offerings determine one's condition in the underworld, not ethical behavior. This administrative logic mirrors earthly courts, where verdicts resolved disputes without appealing to cosmic justice. Stories involving the Anunnaki emphasize procedure. In narratives describing descent into the underworld, entry is regulated, announcements are made, and permission is granted or denied according to rules. When a goddess enters Kur without authorization, the Anunnaki respond not with outrage but with enforcement. Power stripped away at the gates is not humiliation, but protocol. No being, divine or mortal, bypasses the system. This portrayal stands in sharp contrast to modern reinterpretations that cast the Anunnaki as tyrants or engineers. In the tablets, they do not create humanity. They do not rule cities. They do not demand worship directly. Their authority is specific and limited, which is precisely what makes it stable. They do not need to dominate every aspect of existence. They occupy their assigned role and perform it without deviation. The confusion surrounding them arises partly from misunderstanding how ancient religions functioned. Deities were not fixed characters with consistent personalities across all time. Their roles shifted as political centers changed and as stories were retold in new languages. A god prominent in one city might be marginal in another. Titles overlapped. Functions merged. Yet within this fluidity, certain patterns remained constant. The Anunnaki were always divine. They were always authoritative. And they were always embedded within the cosmic structure, never outside it. Modern myths detach the Anunnaki from this context and assign them motives alien to ancient thought. Mining resources, manipulating DNA, traveling between planets are ideas rooted in industrial and scientific worldviews. Bronze Age Mesopotamians did not think in those terms. Their concerns were food, water, labor, fertility, and death. Power expressed itself through control of these forces, not through technology. When ancient texts describe gods shaping humans from clay and blood, the imagery is symbolic and immediate. Clay was the material of everyday life. Blood was visibly associated with vitality. Mixing the two explained why humans think yet die. It did not imply laboratories or experiments. It conveyed truth through familiar materials. To read these stories as literal science is to misunderstand how explanation worked in a pre-scientific culture. The Anunnaki, in particular, are described using language identical to that used for judges and elders in human society. They sit, they deliberate, they pronounce. Their authority is procedural. Even gods who oppose them do not challenge their jurisdiction. When underworld rulings are made, they stand. This consistency reinforces the idea that the cosmos operates according to rules that even divine beings must respect. This is why descent myths are so powerful. When a god enters Kur, stripped of symbols and status, it demonstrates that no amount of power grants exemption from structure. The Anunnaki do not act out of malice. They act because the system demands it. Their presence turns the underworld from chaos into order, from oblivion into managed permanence. The tragedy of later reinterpretations is that they obscure this clarity. By transforming the Anunnaki into villains or benefactors, modern narratives inject morality and intention where none existed. The original texts are colder and more unsettling. They describe a universe where systems matter more than individuals, where function outweighs compassion, and where permanence is valued over justice. This worldview does not require conspiracy to be oppressive. It does not hide its mechanisms. It explains them openly. Humans serve because service maintains order. Death is final because finality prevents collapse. The Anunnaki enforce these truths not as enemies of humanity, but as custodians of structure. Understanding them correctly removes the need for fantasy. The reality is already severe enough. A cosmos where divine judges ensure that no one returns from death does not need extraterrestrial overseers to feel oppressive. The Anunnaki are frightening not because they are cruel, but because they are indifferent. They do not hate humanity. They simply have no reason to intervene on its behalf. This indifference is what makes the system unbreakable. There is no villain to overthrow, no rebellion to stage. The judges sit, the gates remain closed, the dead stay where they are assigned, and the living, knowing this, continue to work, worship, and record their obligations in clay, under a sky governed by powers who never promised freedom and never pretended otherwise. Life within this system unfolded according to rules that were never written as laws of nature, yet were understood as inevitable. From birth to death, every stage of existence reinforced the same lesson. Humans belonged to the gods, and the world belonged to order. Cities were not merely settlements, they were divine estates. Each one was owned by a patron deity whose presence defined its identity, economy, and fate. To live in a city was to live on divine property. The king did not rule as an independent authority. He governed as a steward, managing land, labor, and resources on behalf of a god who was considered the true sovereign. Temple complexes dominated urban centers, not only physically, but economically. Fields, herds, workshops, and storehouses belonged to the god's household. Human labor sustained them, and in return, survival was permitted. Daily life revolved around work assigned and recorded with precision. Barley rations were calculated down to the smallest unit. Beer allocations were standardized. Wool, oil, and bread were distributed according to rank, age, and gender. These records survive in overwhelming numbers, showing a society where every person's contribution was measured. Labor was not merely necessary, it was sacred obligation. To work was to serve the god who owned the land beneath one's feet. This sense of ownership extended into private life. Household gods watched over families, enforcing continuity and obedience within the home. Birth rituals introduced children into the network of obligations binding the living to the divine. From the beginning, a person existed within a web of duties that could not be refused. Even names carried weight, linking individuals to ancestors whose memory required maintenance through offerings and remembrance. Death did not release one from this system. Funerary rituals were among the most critical acts a family could perform. Burial was not about honoring the dead emotionally, but about managing risk. An improperly buried person became dangerous, trapped between worlds, capable of causing illness or misfortune. Graves were often placed beneath the floors of houses, keeping ancestors physically close and symbolically dependent on the living. Offerings to the dead were not gestures of love. They were payments. Water poured onto the grave prevented thirst in the underworld. Food offerings reduced hunger. Without them, the dead suffered and might lash out. The afterlife was not just bleak, it was competitive. Those with descendants fared better than those forgotten. Memory became currency, and fear ensured participation. The underworld itself mirrored the living world in distorted form. It was described as a city, complete with gates, rulers, and hierarchy. But unlike earthly cities, there was no production, no renewal. Everything consumed there depended on what the living provided. This dependence locked generations together. The living worked not only for gods, but for the dead, and in doing so, bound their own descendants to the same cycle. Psychologically, this produced a culture intensely focused on continuity rather than change. Innovation was valued only insofar as it improved efficiency or ritual accuracy. The goal was not transformation, but preservation. When disasters struck, explanations did not seek human error alone. Divine withdrawal was assumed. A god had become displeased. A ritual had been neglected. The response was not rebellion or reform, but increased devotion. Laws emerged within this framework not as expressions of universal justice, but as tools to stabilize society. Legal codes emphasized compensation and restitution rather than moral judgment. Harm disrupted order, and law existed to repair that disruption. Punishment was practical. Justice served the community, not abstract ideals. Even kings were subject to divine law, though consequences often arrived through omens and defeat rather than courts. Despite the absence of cosmic justice, ethical values developed. Honesty, loyalty, restraint, and diligence were praised in wisdom texts. These virtues did not guarantee divine favor, but they improved survival within the system. Social trust mattered. Reputation mattered. A person who lived responsibly reduced risk for themselves and their household. Morality was pragmatic, not salvific. The gods themselves offered no moral reassurance. They behaved unpredictably, driven by comfort, jealousy, and desire. Cities could be destroyed despite perfect ritual compliance. Innocence did not protect against plague or flood. This unpredictability intensified dependence on divination. Signs were sought everywhere: dreams, animal entrails, celestial movements, and unexpected events were read as messages. Understanding divine intention was the closest thing to control humans possessed, yet even perfect interpretation did not guarantee safety. Fate could override warning. Demons could act independently. Disease might strike without cause. This uncertainty reinforced submission. When power cannot be challenged, adaptation becomes the only strategy. Ritual became technology, a means of adjusting probability rather than securing certainty. Within this confinement, humans created art, music, and poetry, not as escape, but as expression. Laments mourned destroyed cities, not as political tragedies, but as moments when gods abandoned their own households. Love poetry celebrated fertility as divine blessing. Epic stories explored mortality without denying it. The acceptance of limits shaped creativity, giving it depth rather than optimism. The prison of this worldview did not crush human spirit, it redirected it. Hope was not placed in the future, but in continuity. One lived so that one's name would be remembered. One built so that walls would endure. One raised children so that offerings would continue. These were not illusions. They were strategies for meaning in a system that promised none. Freedom, as later cultures would define it, did not exist, but neither did despair dominate. The Sumerian world was not nihilistic. It was bounded. Purpose came from fulfilling one's role within those bounds. To serve well was to live correctly. To be remembered was to resist erasure. To accept death was to acknowledge reality. This was the lived experience of the cosmic prison. Not chains and bars, but obligation, memory, and permanence. A system that did not need to threaten because it had already explained itself. Humans labored, worshipped, and died not because they were deceived, but because from the beginning the rules were written into clay, and clay does not argue with the form it is given. The entire structure of this world functioned through boundaries, and boundaries were never symbolic abstractions. They were enforced realities that defined what could exist, where it could exist, and how long it could remain there. Every layer of the cosmos was separated from the next by rules that could not be permanently violated. Heaven did not bleed into earth. Earth did not rise into heaven. The dead did not return. These divisions were the mechanisms that kept order intact. The first and most absolute boundary was vertical. Heaven existed above, earth in the middle, and the underworld below. This arrangement was not poetic imagination. It was spatial logic grounded in everyday observation. Smoke rose upward. Rain fell downward. The dead were buried beneath the ground. The direction of movement mattered because it reflected power. What was above ruled what was below. What fell downward did not rise again. Temples embodied this vertical logic in physical form. Ziggurats were not built for aesthetics. Their stepped levels mirrored the structure of the universe, rising from human space toward divine space, without ever reaching it. Priests ascending these platforms did not believe they were entering heaven. They believed they were approaching the boundary, placing themselves at the point where communication was possible, but transformation was not. Proximity did not mean equality. Height did not mean escape. The boundary between gods and humans was enforced through ritual purity. Divine presence was dangerous. Contact required preparation. Bathing, abstention, special clothing, and controlled speech were not signs of reverence, but precautions. Interaction with power demanded insulation. Without it, the human body and mind could not withstand exposure. This reinforced hierarchy. Gods could cross into human space freely. Humans could not cross upward without permission, and even then only temporarily. The boundary between life and death was even more rigid. Entry into the underworld required transformation, not travel. One did not walk to Kur. One ceased being alive. This made death irreversible not because of punishment, but because reversal would destabilize the system. If the dead returned, offerings would lose meaning. If death could be undone, life would lose urgency. Permanence preserved order. The 7 gates of the underworld existed to ensure this permanence. Each gate removed a layer of identity, not to humiliate, but to standardize. By the time one reached the interior, all distinctions that mattered in life were gone. The system did not care who you had been. It cared that you were now dead. Even divine beings entering Kur were stripped of power, demonstrating that no role carried immunity from structure. Returning from the underworld required substitution. Balance demanded replacement. Someone had to take the place of whoever left. This principle was not negotiable. It appeared repeatedly in myths, because it explained why exceptions did not accumulate. Without substitution, the system would leak. Death would lose finality. Boundaries would erode. The cost of return preserved stability. Horizontal boundaries were equally important. Cities were enclosed by walls not only for defense, but for definition. Inside the walls was order, law, divine protection. Outside lay wilderness, foreign lands, and uncertainty. Crossing a city gate was a transition between controlled space and dangerous space. Travelers performed rituals at gates because thresholds were vulnerable points where order could be disrupted. Doors within homes carried similar significance. Protective symbols were placed at entrances. Figurines were buried beneath thresholds to intercept malevolent forces. These practices were not superstition. They were applied cosmology. If demons originated beyond boundaries, then reinforcing boundaries reduced risk. Architecture became theology in brick and clay. Time itself was divided and controlled. Days followed nights. Months followed lunar cycles. Years were adjusted through ritual intervention to keep seasons aligned. Festivals marked moments when normal boundaries loosened slightly, allowing renewal without collapse. These moments were dangerous as well as necessary. Mistakes during festivals invited disaster because they occurred at points of transition. Kingship functioned as a boundary role. The king stood between gods and people, absorbing responsibility without possessing divine power. Ritual humiliation during festivals reinforced this position. The king was stripped, struck, and forced to confess obedience, demonstrating publicly that authority flowed downward, not upward. Power had limits, and those limits were enforced ritually. The boundary between human and divine knowledge was also maintained. Humans were permitted to know how to perform rituals, interpret signs, and maintain order, but not why the system existed in the first place. Ultimate explanations remained inaccessible. This preserved dependence. Knowledge reduced uncertainty, but did not eliminate it. Complete understanding would have undermined submission. Demons represented boundary violations made flesh. They moved between realms, slipping through cracks when rituals failed or neglect occurred. They caused illness, madness, and misfortune, not as moral agents, but as symptoms of weakened structure. Their existence reinforced vigilance. Protection required constant maintenance. Neglect had consequences. These overlapping boundaries created a dense network of constraint. Movement was possible, but only within defined channels. Change could occur, but only within limits. Even the gods operated within this framework. No deity could abolish death. No god could permanently collapse heaven into earth. The system was older and stronger than any individual power within it. This is why rebellion never appears as a viable option in these texts. There is no story of humanity overthrowing divine authority, because authority is structural, not personal. There is no villain to defeat. The prison is not guarded by enemies. It is upheld by rules that define reality itself. Living within this system required constant awareness of position. Know where you stand. Know what you owe. Know what cannot be crossed. Survival depended not on courage or faith, but on accuracy. Perform the ritual correctly. Speak the words precisely. Maintain the offerings. Bury the dead properly. Remember the names. Freedom was not denied because it was feared. It was denied because it was inconceivable. The world was not built to accommodate it. From the moment heaven was separated from earth and the underworld sealed below, existence became a matter of placement. And once placed, nothing, human or divine, could remain outside the boundaries that defined where it belonged. The system endured because it trained human attention inward, away from escape and toward management. Existence was not framed as a journey toward liberation, but as a condition that had to be handled correctly. Every individual life unfolded inside a web of duties that connected gods, cities, families, and the dead into a single operational structure. Nothing stood alone. Every action echoed beyond itself. From the moment a child was born, their life was already accounted for. Birth rituals did not celebrate individuality. They registered a new unit within the system. Protective prayers placed the infant under divine supervision, not out of affection, but necessity. Survival depended on recognition by higher powers. A person unacknowledged by the gods existed at risk, exposed to illness, misfortune, and premature death. Education reinforced this orientation. Children learned skills that fed continuity: farming, weaving, brewing, construction, record-keeping. Literacy, when granted, was not creative license, but vocational discipline. A scribe copied the same lists, hymns, and formulas until deviation disappeared. Originality was dangerous. Accuracy preserved order. Adulthood marked full integration into labor and ritual cycles. Work schedules aligned with agricultural seasons, dictated by divine calendars. Festivals interrupted routine not as leisure, but as intensified obligation. Participation was mandatory because absence weakened the collective effort sustaining cosmic balance. To withdraw was to endanger everyone. Marriage followed the same logic. It was not primarily romantic or personal. It ensured reproduction, inheritance, and continuity of offerings. A household without descendants faced extinction not only socially but spiritually. Without someone to pour water at the grave, the dead suffered. Family lines existed as conduits of maintenance, transmitting obligation forward through time. Illness revealed the system's underlying assumptions with brutal clarity. Disease was rarely random. It indicated breach, neglect, or intrusion. Treatment combined practical remedies with ritual correction. Herbs addressed symptoms. Incantations addressed causes. Recovery depended not only on physical strength, but on restoring alignment. A healed body signaled repaired order. Misfortune reinforced dependence. When crops failed or enemies attacked, explanations focused upward. A god had withdrawn favor. The cause was rarely debated. The response was immediate intensification of ritual. More offerings, more prayers, more obedience. The solution never involved dismantling the system that produced vulnerability. The system was assumed correct. Failure lay in execution. This mindset shaped memory itself. History was not a record of human achievement, but of divine response. Cities rose because gods favored them. Cities fell because gods abandoned them. Human agency existed only within these parameters. Victory validated piety. Defeat demanded repentance, not resistance. Even grief followed regulated forms. Lamentations did not protest injustice. They acknowledged loss as part of cosmic rhythm. Public mourning rituals allowed collective processing without challenging structure. Pain was expressed, not resolved. Acceptance restored equilibrium. Aging brought no promise of reward. Wisdom texts advised humility and caution, not hope. Old age was not revered as enlightenment, but endured as decline. The body weakened, dependence increased. Eventually, death arrived without ceremony beyond what ritual required. No one was exempt. Kings, priests, laborers all ended the same way. Death itself was managed like any other transition. The body was prepared. Words were spoken. Objects were placed. Boundaries were sealed. Emotion mattered less than procedure. Improper handling threatened the living more than it disrespected the dead. Precision ensured containment. Once in the underworld, the dead continued to exist, but without agency. They did not judge the living or influence destiny unless neglected. Their role was passive, sustained only by offerings. This passivity was essential. Active dead would disrupt the system. Stillness preserved order. The living internalized this logic deeply. Fear was not constant, but awareness was. People understood their fragility. They knew protection was conditional. They adapted by compliance rather than protest. The cost of defiance was too high, the benefit non-existent. What makes this worldview so stable is its lack of contradiction. It did not promise what it could not deliver. It did not claim the universe was fair. It claimed it was ordered. That order demanded work, memory, and submission. In return, it offered survival, not salvation. Creativity existed within limits. Poetry praised gods. Music accompanied ritual. Art decorated temples. None of it questioned hierarchy. Expression served maintenance. Beauty reinforced devotion. Skill honored power. This does not mean humans were unaware of suffering. They recorded it meticulously. Laments, prayers, and proverbs acknowledge exhaustion, grief, and frustration. But these expressions functioned as release valves, not calls to change. They allowed endurance, not transformation. The prison endured because it aligned meaning with necessity. To live was to serve. To serve was to exist correctly. Anything else risked annihilation. The system did not need guards. It had already taught its inhabitants how to think, how to act, and what to expect. Within these confines, life continued generation after generation, not because people believed in freedom, but because they believed in order. And order, once accepted as absolute, becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. The system did not persist merely because it was feared or believed, but because it was rehearsed constantly. Reality was something that had to be reaffirmed through action, day after day, without pause. The cosmos, as understood by these early societies, was not self-correcting. If attention lapsed, order decayed. Maintenance was not symbolic devotion. It was operational necessity. Ritual formed the backbone of this maintenance. Each day unfolded according to sequences that aligned human activity with divine expectation. Dawn marked renewal. Offerings placed before divine statues signaled acknowledgement that the world was still functioning under the gods' authority. These acts were repetitive by design. Repetition stabilized reality. Change introduced risk. The gods were not imagined as omnipresent abstractions. They resided in specific places, inhabiting statues crafted with precise proportions and consecrated through elaborate rites. Once installed, a statue was no longer an object. It was a dwelling. The god was present there, capable of attention, satisfaction, or anger. Caring for that presence was a full-time responsibility. Temple staff followed strict schedules. Statues were washed, clothed, and adorned with jewelry, as one would care for a powerful ruler. Meals were prepared multiple times a day. Incense burned to please divine senses. Music accompanied offerings to create an atmosphere suitable for presence. Silence at the wrong moment or noise at the wrong time risked offense. Precision mattered more than emotion. These rituals required resources on a massive scale. Fields were cultivated to supply grain for offerings. Breweries operated continuously to produce beer fit for divine consumption. Herds were raised for sacrifice, inspected carefully to ensure physical perfection. Imperfection offended. Waste endangered balance. The physical remains of offerings sustained the human workforce. This was not hypocrisy. It was circulation. Divine essence ascended. Material substance descended. The cycle fed everyone involved. Breaking it would starve both gods and humans, destabilizing the system from both ends. Time itself required management. Calendars were sacred instruments, aligning human labor with cosmic rhythms. Months followed the moon. Years followed the sun, adjusted through ritual intervention when misalignment threatened agricultural collapse. Priests monitored these cycles, adding or removing months to keep seasons aligned. This was not astronomy for curiosity, but survival engineering. Festivals marked points of transition when normal boundaries softened. These moments were dangerous and powerful. The old year dissolved. The new year had not yet solidified. During this interval, chaos could intrude unless contained by ritual. Processions, sacrifices, and recitations rebuilt order in real time. The most intense rituals temporarily inverted hierarchy under controlled conditions. Kings were stripped of symbols, struck, and forced to affirm submission to divine authority. This humiliation did not weaken kingship. It renewed it. By demonstrating that power flowed downward from the gods, the ritual reinforced legitimacy. Authority survived because it acknowledged its limits. Sacred performances reenacted myths not as stories, but as acts. When gods were said to defeat chaos, the ritualized retelling made that victory present again. History was not past. It was cyclical. Reenactment prevented regression. Homes mirrored temples on a smaller scale. Household rituals protected families from intrusion. Offerings placed before small figurines acknowledged local divine presence. Daily prayers reinforced alignment. The private and public were not separate spheres. Both were nodes in the same system. Illness, misfortune, and conflict were addressed through corrective ritual. Exorcisms expelled intruding forces. Incantations repaired breaches. Objects used in these rites were disposed of carefully, preventing residual contamination. Healing was not restoration of health alone. It was restoration of order. Writing played a crucial role in maintenance. Ritual texts, hymns, and omen lists preserved correct procedure. Memory was externalized onto clay to prevent drift. Deviation introduced uncertainty. Preservation ensured continuity. To copy a text was to stabilize the future. Priests functioned as technicians rather than prophets. Their authority came from training, not inspiration. Mastery of ritual language, gesture, and timing defined competence. Error endangered entire communities. Success went unnoticed because order, when preserved, appeared invisible. Maintenance extended beyond life. The dead required care. Offerings sustained them. Neglect turned them hostile. Families remained bound to ancestors through regular ritual. Death did not sever obligation. It extended it. Time became layered rather than linear. Even destruction was integrated into this logic. When cities fell, laments were composed to explain divine withdrawal. These texts did not accuse invaders. They documented failure of alignment. Recovery required rebuilding temples and restoring rituals, not rethinking cosmology. The system allowed no endpoint. Maintenance never concluded. There was no final victory, no permanent stability. The effort was endless by design. This ensured engagement. Exhaustion prevented rebellion. Attention focused inward on procedure rather than outward on possibility. What appears oppressive in retrospect functioned as coherence. The world made sense because it was structured, meaning arose from participation, not outcome. One did not ask whether the system was just. One asked whether it was functioning. The prison endured not because its inhabitants were unaware, but because awareness offered no alternative. The rules were visible. The cost of non-compliance was immediate. Survival depended on repetition, accuracy, and submission. Reality, as they understood it, did not wait to be believed. It had to be maintained. And so humanity worked, prayed, recorded, and repeated, generation after generation. Not in pursuit of freedom, but to keep the fragile machinery of existence from collapsing back into silence. Memory was the only force capable of resisting erasure, and even it was fragile. In a world where death led inevitably to the underworld and no soul returned, remembrance became the closest thing to survival available to humans. To be remembered was not to live again, but to avoid complete disappearance. This belief shaped behavior at every level of society, from kings erecting monuments to parents whispering names during ritual offerings. Names carried weight because they anchored existence. A person whose name was spoken still occupied space in the world of the living, even if only as sound and thought. This is why names were carved into stone, impressed into clay, and repeated in prayers. Forgetting was more than neglect. It was a second death, one far more final than the first. Grave offerings were not symbolic gestures of love. They were transactions. Water poured onto the ground seeped downward to the underworld, preventing thirst. Food left at the grave fed the shade. Without these offerings, the dead suffered. Hunger and thirst in the underworld produced restlessness, and restless dead were dangerous. Ghosts without sustenance wandered, bringing illness, nightmares, and misfortune to the living. This fear ensured continuity. Families were bound together not by affection alone, but by obligation across generations. Children were raised with the understanding that one day they would be responsible for maintaining the dead. To fail in this duty was to endanger oneself and others. The afterlife reached back into the present, enforcing discipline through threat rather than promise. The underworld was imagined as crowded and hierarchical. Those with descendants fared better than those forgotten. Kings, priests, and wealthy individuals entered with greater status, reinforced by richer offerings and elaborate burial goods. The poor endured worse conditions, sustained only by minimal remembrance. Equality in death was partial at best. Hierarchy survived the grave. This belief system discouraged isolation. To live without family was to die poorly. Marriage and reproduction were not only social expectations, but spiritual strategies. A lineage ensured offerings would continue. A broken line meant abandonment. Loneliness extended beyond life into eternity. Monuments served this same purpose on a larger scale. Kings inscribed their names on temples, walls, and statues, not only to assert power, but to guarantee memory. These inscriptions often included curses against anyone who defaced them, threatening divine punishment. Memory was protected through fear. The name had to endure. Writing amplified this preservation. Clay tablets outlasted flesh. A name written might be read centuries later, granting a form of delayed existence. Scribes understood this power. They often included their names at the end of texts, embedding themselves into the future through inkless permanence. Literature reinforced this logic. Epic heroes sought fame, not immortality. When eternal life was denied, lasting renown became the substitute. Walls built, cities founded, deeds recorded. These were the means by which humans pushed back against oblivion. The recognition that memory fades did not stop the effort. It intensified it. Laments reflect this desperation vividly. They mourn not only death, but forgetting. Cities destroyed were described as silent, abandoned by gods and people alike. Silence equaled erasure. Sound, especially spoken names and recited prayers, restored presence. Ritual speech kept absence at bay. The living feared becoming forgotten more than dying. Death was certain. Oblivion was conditional. This distinction shaped priorities. Wealth mattered because it funded offerings. Status mattered because it ensured remembrance. Even kindness mattered because it increased the likelihood someone would remember you favorably. The gods themselves were not immune to this logic. They demanded constant praise. Hymns listed their titles repeatedly, reinforcing their presence through sound and repetition. A neglected god weakened. A forgotten god vanished. Divine survival depended on human memory, as much as human survival depended on divine favor. This mutual dependence created a closed circuit. Humans fed gods. Gods sustained order. Order allowed memory to persist. Memory justified labor. The cycle reinforced itself endlessly. Within this framework, history was not progressive. It was accumulative. The past mattered because it anchored the present. Ancestral authority legitimized current power. Innovations were acceptable only if they did not disrupt continuity. Forgetting tradition threatened collapse. Even time was remembered through ritual reenactment. Festivals replayed mythic events, collapsing past into present. By repeating the same stories and actions, people ensured that foundational moments never receded fully into history. The beginning was always close, always accessible. The terror underlying this worldview was not annihilation, but insignificance. To die unlamented, unoffered, unnamed was the ultimate failure. This fear drove compliance more effectively than punishment. One obeyed to be remembered. One served to remain visible. The prison tightened through memory rather than force. People internalized obligation because they understood what forgetting meant. Freedom was not withheld. It was irrelevant. What mattered was endurance, however thin. In this world, memory was labor, and labor was survival. To remember and be remembered was to resist the final darkness, not by escaping it, but by ensuring that even in death, one's presence lingered just long enough to be felt. Power in this world did not flow from virtue, wisdom, or moral authority. It flowed from proximity to the gods and the ability to manage their demands. Kingship existed not as a reward for excellence, but as a functional role within the cosmic system. A king was not chosen because he was good. He was chosen because the gods required an intermediary capable of organizing labor, enforcing ritual, and absorbing responsibility when things went wrong. Royal authority was therefore conditional and fragile. A king ruled only as long as order held. Victory in war, abundance in harvest, and stability within the city were interpreted as signs of divine approval. Failure in any of these areas signaled withdrawal of favor. The king did not argue innocence, he intensified service. More offerings, more temple construction, more public rituals followed disaster, not reform or rebellion. Kings described themselves not as masters, but as shepherds, a metaphor that emphasized control rather than care. Sheep were guided, counted, and sacrificed when necessary. The flock existed for use. This language reflected the king's role precisely. He managed humans on behalf of gods who owned them. His legitimacy depended on how efficiently he performed that task. Temple building was one of the most visible expressions of royal duty. Temples were not monuments to ambition, they were repair work. Mud brick decayed constantly in the Mesopotamian climate. Rebuilding was necessary to prevent divine displeasure. Kings gained prestige by restoring sanctuaries, placing their names in foundation deposits as proof of service rather than conquest. These inscriptions rarely boasted of compassion or justice. They listed offerings, rituals performed, walls raised, and gods honored. Even military victories were framed as acts carried out on divine instruction. The king was an instrument, not an originator. Agency flowed downward. Law functioned within this framework as stabilization rather than moral correction. Legal codes established predictable consequences for actions that disrupted order. Compensation mattered more than intention. A broken bone required payment. A stolen object required restitution. The goal was not to punish evil, but to restore balance. Justice did not extend beyond life. The dead were not rewarded or condemned for their behavior. Ethical conduct mattered because it preserved social cohesion among the living. It had no influence on the afterlife. This separation created a stark realism. One behaved well because society required it, not because the universe would acknowledge it. The gods themselves modeled this detachment. They rewarded loyalty inconsistently and punished negligence disproportionately. Favor could be lost without warning. This unpredictability kept kings and subjects alike in a state of vigilance. Security depended on constant attention. Rebellion against authority rarely appears in surviving texts, and when it does, it ends in catastrophe. Disorder invited invasion, famine, and divine abandonment. Stability required hierarchy. Even injustice was preferable to collapse. This belief did not arise from ignorance, it arose from experience. Floods destroyed everything without discrimination. Only structure offered protection. Kings absorbed collective anxiety. When disasters struck, laments named them directly, accusing them of failing the gods. This public blame reinforced the system. Responsibility had a face. The cosmos remained abstract. The king became the pressure point through which frustration passed, without threatening the structure itself. Despite their power, kings were never free. Ritual humiliation reminded them of this fact. During major festivals, the king was stripped of insignia, struck, and forced to declare submission. Tears were expected. Only after demonstrating obedience was authority restored. Power existed only through surrender. Succession followed similar logic. Dynasties mattered because continuity stabilized ritual. A sudden break risked disorder. Kings traced lineage not to assert blood superiority, but to show uninterrupted service. Gaps invited suspicion. Continuity reassured both gods and people. War, when it occurred, wasn't framed as conquest for expansion. It was framed as correction. Enemies were those whose gods opposed yours. Victory proved divine strength. Defeat proved divine displeasure. Strategy mattered, but theology explained outcome. This worldview discouraged innovation in governance. Change threatened balance. Successful models were copied, not improved. Authority endured by repetition. The past was safer than the unknown. For ordinary people, kingship represented both protection and threat. A competent king ensured stability. An incompetent one invited disaster. Loyalty was pragmatic. Dissent endangered everyone. Silence preserved survival. The prison did not require tyrants. It required managers. Kings were its most visible functionaries, maintaining alignment between human effort and divine demand. They ruled because someone had to bear responsibility for a system that could not be questioned. In this structure, power did not liberate, it bound. The higher one rose, the more tightly obligation closed. Kings stood closest to the gods, and therefore closest to failure. Their fate mirrored humanity's own. Service without guarantee, authority without freedom, and eventual descent into the same darkness that awaited every subject they governed. Beyond kings and temples, beyond gods and ghosts, the system reached into the most intimate spaces of human thought. It shaped how people understood chance, suffering, and the limits of control. The world was not perceived as random, but neither was it just. Events happened for reasons, yet those reasons were rarely aligned with human concepts of fairness. This tension produced a mindset focused not on changing outcomes, but on interpreting signals. Divination became the primary way humans attempted to negotiate uncertainty. If the future could not be altered through moral behavior, perhaps it could be anticipated through signs. Nothing was too small to matter. The flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the twitch of an animal's liver, a crack in a wall, a strange dream, each carried potential meaning. Reality was saturated with messages, and ignoring them was dangerous. This practice was not chaotic or improvised. It was systematic, catalogued, and institutionalized. Vast collections of omen texts listed conditions and outcomes in precise language. If a mark appeared on the right side of the liver, one result followed. If it appeared on the left, another. Thousands of possibilities were recorded, refined over generations. Divination became a science of pattern recognition within a closed universe. The purpose of this knowledge was not enlightenment. It was risk management. If disaster could not be prevented entirely, perhaps its timing or severity could be mitigated. A bad omen might delay a military campaign. A favorable sign might encourage a contract. Decisions were not made on confidence, but on probability filtered through divine intention. Dreams held particular significance because they bypassed waking control. When the mind slept, gods and spirits could speak directly. Dream interpretation manuals explained how to decode images. Water signaled abundance or danger, depending on clarity. Falling indicated loss of status. Flying suggested divine attention. These interpretations were not personal. They were standardized. A dream meant the same thing regardless of who dreamed it. This uniformity reinforced the idea that individuals did not possess unique destinies. Meaning was external, imposed, and shared. personal interpretation mattered less than correct decoding. To misunderstand a sign was to misalign oneself with reality. Magic, in this context, was not rebellion against the system, but an extension of it. Incantations did not challenge divine authority. They appealed to it. Spells invoked gods by name, recited established formulas, and followed strict procedures. Innovation was dangerous. A wrong word could invite harm. Correct repetition ensured effectiveness. Demons occupied the margins of this system, embodying breakdown rather than opposition. They were not enemies of the gods, but consequences of imbalance. When rituals failed or boundaries weakened, demons entered. They caused illness, madness, and misfortune, not out of malice, but function. Their presence signaled error. Exorcism did not destroy demons, it relocated them. Rituals sent them back to their proper realm, restoring order. The goal was containment, not elimination. Chaos could not be eradicated, only managed. Human agency existed within these limits. People could act, but only by following prescribed channels. Free will, as later philosophies would define it, had no relevance. Choice was constrained by knowledge of consequence. To ignore omens was to invite disaster. To defy ritual was to risk annihilation. This produced a psychology of vigilance. Attention was survival. One watched the world closely, listening for signs of divine mood. Complacency was punished. Awareness was rewarded, though never guaranteed. Yet this constant alertness did not produce paranoia alone. It also produced humility. Humans knew they were small within vast systems they could not command. Acceptance of limitation became a virtue. Wisdom literature praised restraint, patience, and silence. Speaking too much attracted attention. Attention attracted risk. Suffering, when it arrived, was endured rather than explained away. People lamented openly, but they did not expect relief through protest. Laments addressed gods not with accusation, but with acknowledgement of power. "You did this" was less important than "you can stop it." Hope rested in appeasement, not justice. This worldview stripped meaning from progress. Improvement was temporary. Stability was success. The best outcome was continuity without disruption. Change was tolerated only when guided by divine instruction or necessity. Despite this, people loved, celebrated, and created bonds. Joy existed, but it was fragile. Happiness was appreciated precisely because it was temporary. Festivities were intense because their end was certain. Pleasure was not denied, but it was never mistaken for permanence. Old age brought resignation rather than reward. Wisdom meant understanding what could not be changed. The elderly advised caution, not ambition. They taught younger generations how to endure rather than how to escape. In this context, hope was modest. It did not aim at transformation of the world. It aimed at survival within it, to live another year, to avoid disaster, to ensure burial, to be remembered. The prison did not suppress thought. It shaped it. Minds turned inward, refining techniques of interpretation and maintenance. Philosophy, in its earliest form, was practical. How to live under power without provoking it. This is why the system lasted so long. It did not rely on illusion. It relied on adaptation. Humans adjusted themselves to reality rather than demanding reality adjust to them. They learned to read signs, follow rules, and endure outcomes. In doing so, they accepted a world that did not promise meaning beyond function. And within that acceptance, they built civilizations that lasted centuries, sustained not by freedom or hope, but by understanding the limits of both. As centuries passed, the structure remained, but its surface shifted. Languages changed, cities fell, and new powers rose, yet the underlying logic endured. When Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, the gods did not disappear. They were renamed, merged, and reorganized, but their functions stayed intact. The prison adapted without loosening its grip. New myths emerged, retold in different tongues, but they carried the same assumptions. Humanity remained a workforce created for service. Death remained final. The underworld remained unavoidable. Even when stories became more elaborate, they did not soften these truths. Complexity did not mean comfort. It meant refinement. Later epics expanded earlier themes rather than replacing them. Heroes traveled farther, struggled longer, and suffered more deeply, but they did not escape their fate. The search for immortality became a central narrative device, not because it was achievable, but because its denial needed explanation. The answer was always the same. Immortality belonged to the gods alone. The figure of the hero shifted subtly. Early heroes were kings who ruled cities and performed rituals correctly. Later heroes became wanderers, seekers, individuals confronting the limits of existence directly. Yet their journeys ended in acceptance, not triumph. Knowledge replaced hope. Understanding replaced victory. This evolution reflects a deepening awareness of confinement rather than its rejection. As societies grew larger and more complex, the system required stronger justification. Myths became introspective, exploring grief, friendship, and loss with greater emotional depth. But the conclusion never changed. Death could not be undone. The underworld could not be escaped. The afterlife remained bleak even as storytelling grew richer. Descriptions became more vivid, but not more merciful. Dust, darkness, hunger, and thirst persisted. Offerings still mattered. Memory still mattered. Ethical behavior still had no effect on one's fate after death. The rules remained fixed. Legal systems also evolved, becoming more detailed and standardized. Codes expanded to cover new scenarios, but their purpose stayed the same: maintain order among the living. Justice was procedural. Punishment restored balance. The law did not promise fairness beyond practicality. Political power centralized, yet kings remained servants. Empires replaced city-states, but rulers still framed authority as divine mandate. Failure still meant divine abandonment. Conquest expanded the system geographically without altering its logic. New territories were absorbed into the same ritual framework. Temples continued to dominate economic life. Even as trade networks expanded, the flow of resources still funneled toward divine households. The gods required feeding regardless of scale. Bureaucracy grew to meet demand. Record-keeping intensified. Control tightened through documentation. Religion did not become more ethical. Gods remained volatile. Suffering remained arbitrary. This consistency preserved credibility. A system that admits indifference is harder to disprove than one that promises justice. People trusted what matched experience. The underworld gained additional figures and stories, but its function stayed constant. Judges judged. Gates closed. No permanent return occurred. Even divine exceptions required substitution. Balance was never violated without cost. Over time, the prison became less visible because it was more thoroughly internalized. People no longer needed constant reminders of boundaries. They lived them instinctively. Ritual precision became habit. Submission became common sense. Art from later periods reflects this internalization. Scenes of worship dominate. Kings are shown smaller than gods. Humans are depicted as petitioners rather than challengers. Scale communicates hierarchy visually, reinforcing theology without words. Even rebellion narratives, when they appear, end in reinforcement of order. Chaos is dangerous. Stability is preferable. The lesson remains consistent across centuries. As empires fell and rose, the system outlived them. It absorbed new populations, new languages, new customs, and reshaped them to fit its logic. Conquerors adopted local gods. Foreign rulers rebuilt temples. The prison was portable. This endurance reveals its true strength. It was not imposed by force alone. It aligned with human vulnerability, fear of death, fear of chaos, fear of forgetting all pointed in the same direction, toward order at any cost. By the time later cultures inherited these traditions, the foundations were so deep they felt natural. Even when new religions emerged, they borrowed structure, imagery, and language from what came before. Heaven and hell replaced the underworld, but finality remained. Judgment replaced administration, but permanence survived. The Sumerian world did not vanish. It transformed. Its assumptions echoed forward, shaping how later civilizations understood work, authority, death, and meaning. The prison expanded across time, not space. This continuity is unsettling because it suggests that confinement was not an early mistake corrected by progress. It was an early solution to existential uncertainty that proved durable. Order, once accepted as supreme, resists dismantling. The earliest writers did not imagine freedom because they did not see how it could function without collapse. Stability required constraint. Constraint required obedience. And obedience, once normalized, became invisible. By the end of this long evolution, the system no longer needed to explain itself. It was embedded in law, ritual, memory, and habit. People lived inside it without naming it. The prison had become the world. And that may be its most enduring legacy. Not a set of myths or gods, but a way of organizing existence that equated survival with submission and continuity with acceptance of limits that no generation ever fully escaped. As this worldview matured, its influence reached beyond religion and governance into how people understood themselves as thinking beings. Identity was never imagined as autonomous or self-defining. A person did not discover who they were by looking inward. They learned who they were by observing their position within the system. Selfhood was relational, determined by family, city, God, and obligation. To exist was to be located. The concept of an inner self, separate from duty, had little relevance. Thoughts, emotions, and desires mattered only insofar as they affected behavior. What one felt privately did not outweigh what one owed publicly. The system did not require sincerity. It required compliance. This distinction shaped psychological development in ways difficult to reconcile with modern assumptions about individuality. Language itself reinforced this orientation. Words for person carried implications of role and status rather than inner essence. A man was a worker, a son, a subject, a servant of a god. A woman was a daughter, a wife, a bearer of continuity, a ritual participant. These identities overlapped, but none existed independently. To step outside them was not self-expression. It was danger. Emotion was regulated through ritual expression rather than introspection. Grief was permitted, but only in prescribed forms. Laments followed patterns. Cries of suffering addressed gods, not fate or injustice. Anger towards divine authority had no outlet. Resentment, if felt, had nowhere to go. The system absorbed emotion and redirected it into maintenance. This redirection prevented psychological fracture. In a world where suffering was arbitrary and unavoidable, focusing inward might have led to despair. Instead, attention was placed outward, toward action. What must be done next? Which ritual must be performed? Which offering must be made? Action displaced reflection. Dreams were one of the few spaces where the inner world mattered. But even there, interpretation stripped them of personal meaning. A dream was not about you. It was about what the gods were communicating through you. The individual served as conduit, not author, meaning flowed from above, not within. This had profound consequences for concepts of responsibility. People were accountable for actions, not intentions. Accident and malice could produce the same outcome, and therefore the same response. The law did not inquire deeply into motivation. It addressed consequence. Harm occurred. Balance required repair. Shame functioned differently as well. Shame did not arise from failing to be authentic. It arose from failing to fulfill obligation. A person who neglected ritual, disrespected hierarchy, or endangered others through error carried guilt regardless of personal feelings. Public failure mattered more than private doubt. This emphasis shaped education. Children were not encouraged to question, but to remember. Memorization trained obedience. Repetition trained precision. Curiosity was tolerated only within boundaries. Asking how to perform a ritual better was acceptable. Asking why the ritual existed was not useful. Even creativity operated within strict frameworks. Poetry followed established forms. Music adhered to ritual function. Art emphasized clarity and symbolism over innovation. Deviation risked misunderstanding, and misunderstanding risked offense. Beauty reinforced order rather than challenging it. The system did not eliminate joy, it contextualized it. Celebration was intense because it was temporary. Pleasure was allowed during festivals because boundaries would soon close again. This rhythm prevented excess. Joy did not expand into entitlement. It remained permission-based. Love existed, but it was secondary to duty. Marriage contracts prioritized alliance and inheritance. Affection was not dismissed, but it was not foundational. Emotional fulfillment was a bonus, not a right. Expecting the system to provide happiness would have been seen as naive. This acceptance of limitation fostered resilience. People learned to endure without expectation of resolution. Loss was integrated rather than resisted. Death was prepared for rather than denied. The self was not shattered by mortality because it had never been defined by permanence. The cost of this resilience was suppression of possibility. Alternative ways of being were difficult to imagine. Without a concept of inner freedom, rebellion had no psychological footing. Resistance required imagining a self separate from obligation, and that separation did not exist. Over time, this internalization made the prison almost invisible. People did not feel constrained because constraint defined normalcy. The absence of freedom was not experienced as loss because it was never promised. Security mattered more than choice. When later cultures encountered these ideas, they often misunderstood them as pessimism. In truth, they represented adaptation. The system did not claim the world was good. It claimed it was survivable if managed correctly. This honesty prevented disillusionment. The psychological architecture mirrored the cosmic one. Just as heaven, earth, and underworld were fixed, so too were roles, duties, and outcomes. Movement was possible within levels, but not between them. Acceptance maintained coherence. This worldview did not encourage introspection, but it did encourage awareness. People watched themselves closely for error, not authenticity. They adjusted behavior to align with expectation. Self-improvement meant reducing risk, not expanding potential. By shaping identity around function rather than essence, the system ensured continuity. People replaced one another without disrupting structure. Individuals mattered, but only as long as they fulfilled their role. Memory preserved them briefly. Obligation outlasted them. This is how the prison extended inward. It did not rely on force alone. It shaped thought, emotion, and identity to fit its architecture. By the time a person recognized limitation, it felt natural. By the time they questioned it, they lacked the language to imagine anything else. And so the system endured not only in stone and clay, but in minds trained to see order as survival, obedience as wisdom, and acceptance of limits as the only way a human life could make sense at all. Eventually, this system encountered pressure not from within, but from time itself. As generations passed and societies expanded, contradictions accumulated quietly. They did not shatter the structure, but they stressed it. People continued to perform rituals, maintain temples, and record obligations, yet lived experience increasingly revealed gaps between effort and outcome. Cities that served faithfully still fell. Kings who rebuilt temples still died in disgrace. Precision did not guarantee protection. These fractures did not produce revolution. They produced reinterpretation. The system responded by absorbing doubt rather than confronting it. New explanations emerged that preserved structure while addressing disillusionment. Fate became more prominent, not as an enemy of divine will, but as its companion. If even gods were subject to fate, then injustice required no apology. It was embedded. This shift subtly changed how suffering was understood. Rather than signaling ritual failure alone, suffering could indicate destiny. A person afflicted was not necessarily negligent. They were unlucky. This distinction mattered psychologically. It allowed endurance without self-blame while leaving the system intact. Fate relieved anxiety without offering escape. Wisdom literature from later periods reflects this adjustment. Texts advise moderation, silence, and acceptance rather than ritual correction alone. They warn that prosperity and disaster arrive without warning. Effort matters, but outcomes remain uncertain. The message is not despair, but realism. Expect less. Endure more. The gods themselves appear more distant in these writings. They still demand service, but their motives are less visible. Divine silence becomes a theme. Prayer does not always receive response. Ritual does not always produce result. This silence is not framed as abandonment, but as mystery. Mystery replaces explanation. The underworld remains unchanged. No new mercy appears. No promise of return emerges. If anything, descriptions become colder. Death is described with resignation rather than fear. The finality of it all becomes a given rather than a threat. Acceptance deepens. Yet even as resignation grows, the system tightens its grip through habit. What begins as belief ends as routine. People perform rituals not because they expect change, but because stopping feels dangerous. The cost of interruption outweighs the cost of continuation. Inertia becomes protection. Foreign influence introduces new gods, but not new logic. Conquerors adopt local rituals. Empires merge pantheons. Names change. Functions remain. The prison is translated, not dismantled. Even new deities are assigned roles within the existing structure. Nothing escapes classification. Trade expands horizons, but not metaphysics. Merchants travel farther than ever before, encountering unfamiliar lands and customs, yet the cosmos remains the same. Foreign gods are treated as powerful neighbors, not alternatives. The idea that the system itself might be wrong does not arise. Writing becomes more reflective, but not rebellious. Scribes comment on older texts, clarifying meaning, preserving tradition. Commentary reinforces authority. Interpretation replaces innovation. The past is not questioned, it is managed. Even when catastrophe strikes repeatedly, explanations return to alignment. A city destroyed twice is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of deeper displeasure or destiny. The solution remains ritual intensification or patient endurance. Structural critique remains absent. What appears from the outside as stagnation functions internally as survival. The system adapts by lowering expectations. Hope is narrowed. Ambition is contained. Desire is regulated. By shrinking what people believe possible, disappointment is minimized. This gradual recalibration produces a quieter worldview. Early myths are bold and cosmic. Later texts are introspective and cautious. The universe does not change. Human response to it matures into endurance rather than protest. The prison does not crack because it does not promise. It offers no salvation to be disappointed by. It offers continuity, not justice. When justice fails to appear, nothing breaks. That absence was never denied. By this stage, belief is no longer the engine. Practice is. People perform rituals because their parents did. They record obligations because records exist. They fear neglect because stories warn against it. The system sustains itself through memory and habit rather than conviction. This is perhaps its most formidable adaptation. A structure maintained by belief can collapse when belief falters. A structure maintained by routine persists even when belief fades. The prison becomes invisible because it no longer requires explanation. The gods may feel distant, but their absence does not imply freedom. It implies vulnerability. Without divine attention, chaos threatens. Ritual continues as insurance against neglect, not as expression of devotion. In this phase, humans do not argue with the universe. They adjust to it. They learn where effort matters and where it does not. They conserve energy. They invest in stability. They prepare for death without expectation. The tragedy is not despair, but limitation. Possibility narrows quietly. Alternatives never form. Without imagining a different order, none can be pursued. Acceptance hardens into worldview. Yet within this narrowed space, life continues. Families form. Work is done. Songs are sung. Laughter exists. Meaning is local and temporary, but real. The system does not erase humanity. It contains it. This containment proves durable precisely because it does not rely on illusion. It does not promise reward beyond reach. It does not threaten eternal punishment. It simply describes how things are and how they remain. By absorbing doubt rather than resisting it, the prison survives intact. It does not collapse under scrutiny because scrutiny finds no contradiction, only limits. And limits, once accepted, become indistinguishable from reality itself. When later civilizations encountered fragments of this worldview, they often misunderstood its severity as simplicity. From a distance, it can appear that these early societies lacked imagination or aspiration. In truth, they understood limitation with brutal clarity. What they lacked was not creativity, but illusion. They did not expect the universe to care. They expected it to persist. As cultures changed and older gods faded from worship, the structure they upheld did not disappear. It migrated. Ideas of hierarchy, obligation, and finality were carried forward into new religious and philosophical systems. Heaven and hell replaced the underworld, but the logic of judgment and permanence remained. Service to gods transformed into service to moral law, yet obedience continued to define virtue. Work retained its moral weight. Labor was no longer framed solely as divine obligation, but it remained central to identity. To contribute was to justify existence. Idleness became suspect. This echoes the earliest belief that humanity existed to perform necessary tasks within a larger system it did not control. Death, too, retained its gravity. Even as new religions promised reward or punishment beyond the grave, anxiety surrounding remembrance persisted. Names, legacies, and monuments continued to matter. Memory remained a defense against disappearance. The fear of being forgotten survived theological shifts intact. Modern concepts of progress obscure how deeply these ancient assumptions endure. The belief that order must be maintained through effort, that chaos lurks just beyond attention, and that systems collapse without constant upkeep are not relics. They are foundations. Bureaucracy, law, and ritualized behavior all reflect the same impulse: stabilize reality through repetition. Even the separation between personal morality and structural necessity persists. Individuals are encouraged to behave ethically, yet systems operate according to power, efficiency, and control rather than justice. This dissonance mirrors the ancient divide between human ethics and divine indifference. The gods have changed. The structure has not. What distinguishes the earliest worldview is not its darkness, but its honesty. It did not soften death. It did not disguise labor as fulfillment. It did not promise transcendence. It offered survival within limits and asked nothing more. Later systems often promise more and deliver less. This is why the ancient model remains unsettling. It strips away consolation. It exposes how much of modern comfort depends on belief rather than certainty. When belief falters, the underlying structure remains, indifferent and demanding. The prison was never a place. It was a pattern, a way of organizing existence that prioritizes continuity over freedom, stability over meaning, and endurance over fulfillment. Once established, such a pattern does not vanish. It adapts. The earliest writers did not imagine a future where humanity would escape limitation. They imagined a future where humanity would continue. That continuation required acceptance, not rebellion. It required maintenance, not hope. Their legacy is not pessimism. It is realism without mercy, a recognition that existence does not negotiate. One either adapts or perishes. Meaning is constructed locally, temporarily, and with effort. There is no final release. This worldview does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. It reveals what remains when consolation is removed. What is left is work, memory, relationship, and endurance. These are not small things. They are sufficient. Modern audiences may recoil from this severity, but it deserves respect. It sustained civilizations for millennia. It allowed people to live without pretending the universe was kind. It offered coherence when hope was dangerous. In a world increasingly defined by uncertainty, this ancient clarity feels uncomfortably relevant. Systems still demand maintenance. Power still operates without moral obligation. Death remains final regardless of belief. Memory still fades. What changes is not the structure, but our willingness to acknowledge it. The earliest civilizations did not look away. They pressed their understanding into clay and let it harden. The prison they described was not designed to torment. It was designed to function. Humanity fit within it because humanity had to. There was no alternative. And perhaps that is the most difficult inheritance of all, the idea that freedom is not guaranteed, meaning is not universal, and survival itself may be the highest achievement available. They lived with that knowledge. They built with it. They wrote with it. They died with it. And in doing so, they left behind not a warning or a prophecy, but a mirror, reflecting what remains when hope is stripped away and only structure endures. What remains, after all, gods have been renamed, all empires collapsed, and all rituals forgotten is not belief, but structure. The final insight carried by these earliest texts is not theological, but existential. They do not argue that the universe is cruel. They demonstrate that the universe is organized without reference to human desire. Order exists, but it does not comfort. Continuity persists, but it does not care who maintains it. The ancient system did not fail because it was wrong. It faded because societies outgrew its language, not its logic. The mechanisms it described, hierarchy, obligation, maintenance, finality, never disappeared. They simply reappeared under different names. What once belonged to gods now belongs to systems. What was once ritual is now procedure. What was once divine indifference is now structural inertia. The underworld did not vanish. It transformed into abstraction. Death remains irreversible. Memory remains fragile. Forgetting still erases. The fear that animated grave offerings now animates archives, records, data, and legacy. Humans still work to be remembered. They still build to delay disappearance. They still fear silence. Labor remains central. It is no longer framed as service to gods, yet survival still depends on contribution. Systems reward participation and punish neglect. Idleness is still dangerous. Productivity remains moralized. The logic persists even when the theology does not. Power continues to operate without obligation to fairness. Institutions behave much like ancient gods, responsive to pressure, indifferent to individuals, concerned with stability above all else. When disruption occurs, responsibility is placed on managers, leaders, or intermediaries, not on the structure itself. Failure is personal. Order is sacred. The ancient prison did not rely on deception. It relied on accuracy. It described the limits of existence plainly and asked humanity to adapt. That adaptation required humility, endurance, and acceptance. These traits remain relevant because the conditions that demanded them have not changed. Modern narratives often promise escape through progress, technology, enlightenment, or transcendence, yet each promise carries conditions, each creates new dependencies, each requires maintenance. The pattern repeats. What changes is scale, not substance. The earliest writers did not imagine that humanity would conquer death. They imagined that humanity would learn to live with it. They did not imagine that suffering would be eliminated. They imagined that suffering would be managed. Their worldview does not inspire hope, but it does cultivate resilience. Resilience is not optimism. It is the capacity to function without guarantee, to act without assurance of reward, to maintain order knowing it may still collapse. This is not comforting, but it is durable. The prison they described was not a punishment imposed for failure. It was the cost of existence in a finite world. Boundaries preserved coherence. Finality preserved meaning. Obligation preserved continuity. Without these constraints, the system would dissolve. In rejecting illusion, these early thinkers achieved something rare. They faced reality without disguise. They accepted that the universe did not exist for humanity. Humanity existed within it. That distinction changes everything. The final lesson is not submission to gods, but recognition of limits. Freedom, if it exists, is not escape from structure. It is navigation within it. Meaning is not given. It is constructed temporarily, locally, and with effort. The ancient prison doesn't ask to be feared. It asks to be understood. Once understood, it loses its mystique, but not its relevance. The walls were never physical. They were structural, and structures persist. In the end, the earliest texts do not condemn humanity. They describe it, vulnerable, capable, limited, enduring, created to work, destined to die, and driven to remember. This is not a curse. It is a condition. Whether one finds that condition unbearable or sufficient depends on expectation. The earliest civilizations expected nothing beyond survival and continuity. They built meaning from that ground up. Their legacy is not despair. It is clarity. A reminder that before hope, before freedom, before progress, there was order, and that order demanded participation without promise. That demand has never disappeared. It has only changed its voice. And so the final truth pressed into clay thousands of years ago remains intact. Existence is not a gift with instructions for happiness. It is a structure with requirements. To live is to meet them. To fail is to vanish. Everything else is interpretation.